No. October 27, 1962. If you know your Cold War history, you know what that date means. It was the single most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that most historians still consider the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. Kennedy and Khrushchev were negotiating furiously. Diplomats were talking. The whole world was holding its breath. And somewhere under the Atlantic Ocean, about 300 miles northeast of Cuba, a Soviet submarine called B-59 was having what can only be described as a catastrophically bad day. This is the story of that submarine, and the one man on it who decided, against every instinct and every pressure in that room, to wait before doing something irreversible. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. To understand what B-59 was doing down there, you have to go back to the beginning of October 1962. The Soviet Union had secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The U.S. had figured this out via spy plane photographs. Kennedy had announced a naval blockade, and the two superpowers were now locked in the most intense diplomatic standoff since the Second World War. What almost nobody knew, including, critically, the Americans enforcing the blockade, was that the Soviets had also sent 4 diesel-powered submarines into the Caribbean as part of the same operation. Each submarine carried 22 torpedoes, and one of those 22 torpedoes, on each boat, had a nuclear warhead. The yield on that nuclear torpedo? Roughly equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The Americans didn't know the submarines were nuclear-armed. They didn't know the submarines were out there at all, initially. And they definitely didn't know that. On at least one of those boats, the situation was about to become considerably more dangerous than anyone on the surface could imagine. Let's talk about what it was actually like inside B-59 by October 27th. The submarine had been at sea for weeks, having left its base on the Kola Peninsula in the Arctic Circle on October 1st. It had crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean underwater, in secret, heading for Cuba. By late October, several things had gone wrong. The air conditioning had failed. In a submarine, underwater, in the Caribbean, in October, the air conditioning had failed. The temperature inside the boat had climbed to somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Celsius. That's 113 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew of 78 men were operating in conditions that would be unacceptable in a sauna, let alone a military vessel responsible for a nuclear weapon. Carbon dioxide levels were rising. Men were fainting at their stations, and for several days, B-59 had been running too deep to pick up any radio signals, which meant the crew had no idea what was happening above them. They didn't know the state of the negotiations. They didn't know whether Kennedy and Khrushchev were still talking. They had intercepted some U.S. civilian radio broadcasts earlier in the trip, but at depth, they'd gone completely dark. 78 men, no air conditioning, no communication, no news from Moscow, somewhere in the Atlantic, probably near Cuba, probably surrounded by American warships. It was, by any reasonable standard, a terrible situation. Then it got worse. On the afternoon of October 27th, a U.S. Navy task force, 11 destroyers and the aircraft carrier USS Randolph, located B-59. What happened next sounds, in retrospect, like a catastrophic failure of communication between two sides who did not understand what the other was doing. The U.S. Navy had actually issued a public notice that they would be dropping small signaling depth charges, practice charges, not weapons, to force Soviet submarines to surface and identify themselves. This was standard procedure under the quarantine rules. The charges were designed to rattle the submarine, not destroy it. The message was, "We know you're there. Come up." B-59 had not received that message. So from inside the submarine, here is what the crew experienced. After days of heat, exhaustion, darkness, and complete silence from Moscow, explosions started going off around them. Not small, ignorable pops. Explosions, close enough to knock people around. The submarine shook. Lights flickered, equipment rattled, and nobody inside knew they were signaling charges. Captain Valentin Savitsky, the commander of B-59, reached a conclusion that was, under the circumstances, entirely understandable. He concluded that the war had started. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Later accounts quote him as saying, "Maybe the war has already started up there. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." To be clear, from inside that submarine, in that heat, in that darkness, having heard nothing from Moscow for days, and now being surrounded by explosions, this was not an irrational thought. This was a man in an impossible situation reaching an understandable, if catastrophically wrong, conclusion. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed with the captain. That was 2 out of 3. On most Soviet submarines carrying nuclear torpedoes, only the captain and the political officer needed to agree to authorize a launch. 2 signatures, and the torpedo could fire, but B-59 had a third person whose agreement was required. That was because Vasily Arkhipov wasn't just the executive officer of B-59. He was the chief of staff of the entire 4-submarine brigade, meaning he outranked the situation in a very specific way that required his signature on any nuclear launch. 3 signatures needed, 2 in favor, 1 left. Everyone looked at Arkhipov. Now, let's be precise about what Arkhipov was being asked to do. He was being asked to authorize the launch of a nuclear weapon, comparable in destructive power to the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, at a U.S. Navy carrier group in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, based on the information available inside that submarine at that moment. That information being, "It's very hot, we can't breathe properly, we haven't heard from Moscow in days, and there are explosions going off outside." Arkhipov said no. He didn't say it quietly. An argument broke out. There are accounts of raised voices, of genuine fury. Savitsky was not a man who took disagreement well, and he had just ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for combat readiness. He had already told his crew they were going to fire. Arkhipov argued against it. His position was essentially this: "We don't actually know that a war has started. We haven't confirmed it. We have no communication with Moscow. We have no way of verifying what's happening on the surface. And firing a nuclear weapon against the United States Navy in the middle of a standoff without confirmation from command is not a decision we should make based on what we can hear through the hull of a submarine." He argued for surfacing first. Find out what's actually happening, then decide. It's worth pausing on what Arkhipov's position actually required of him in that room. He was not the captain. He was not the political officer. His role gave him a veto on the nuclear launch, but he was still arguing against the 2 senior men on the vessel, in front of the crew, in a crisis situation where the captain had already publicly committed to firing. To say no in that moment was not a small thing. It meant standing in a 50-degree submarine, barely able to breathe, surrounded by explosions, and telling the captain of the boat, who believed they were under attack, that he was wrong. The source of Arkhipov's authority in that argument wasn't just his rank. It was also, according to historians, his reputation. A year earlier, in 1961, Arkhipov had been deputy commander of a nuclear submarine called K-19 when its reactor coolant system failed in the North Atlantic. The reactor began to overheat toward meltdown. Engineers worked in conditions of lethal radiation to stabilize it. All 7 of them died within a month from acute radiation sickness. Arkhipov himself was exposed. The incident was classified for decades. But the men who knew about it, who had watched Arkhipov during that crisis, knew he was not someone who panicked. He was someone who stayed calm when the situation was as bad as it could get. That reputation was in the room with him on October 27th. He persuaded Savitsky to surface. Late in the evening of October 27th, B-59 surfaced. It came up in the middle of the U.S. Navy task force that had been tracking it. What happened next was not exactly a gentle welcome. According to Arkhipav's own later account, the Americans immediately lit up the submarine with powerful searchlights. Aircraft flew over the conning tower at altitudes of 20 to 30 meters, barely above their heads. Warning shots were fired from automatic cannons, over 300 shells, past and alongside the submarine. Destroyers cut across B-59's path at dangerously close distances. Loudspeakers yelled at them to stop engines. This, from the American perspective, was apparently, "We're just trying to communicate." From the Soviet perspective, standing on the conning tower of a submarine that just surfaced in the middle of 11 destroyers and an aircraft carrier being blinded by searchlights and shot at, it was somewhat less clear. Savitsky's later account describes the commander standing on the conning tower, blinded, convinced for a moment that this was it. But contact was eventually established with the destroyer USS Coney. The situation was clarified. No war had started. The depth charges were signaling devices. The Americans hadn't known B-59 was nuclear-armed. Nobody had been trying to sink them. B-59 was ordered by the Soviet fleet to set course back to the Soviet Union. The torpedo was never fired. The Americans, at the time, had no idea how close it had come. They didn't know the submarine was nuclear-armed. They didn't know an argument had been happening below decks about whether to fire. They didn't know that, for a period of time, 2 of the 3 men with launch authority had been in favor. This entire episode, the most dangerous moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis, according to historians who later reviewed the full record, was invisible from the surface. Former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, learning about it decades later, said, "We came very, very close to nuclear war, closer than we knew at the time." Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, said of Arkhipov in 2002, "A guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." Think about what that means. Kennedy and Khrushchev are the names history remembers from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The back-channel negotiations, the final agreement, the removal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade. All of that was real and important. But the entire negotiation could have been made irrelevant by a decision made in a 50-degree submarine by an exhausted crew who hadn't heard from Moscow in days if one man had voted differently. So what happened to Vasily Arkhipov? After B-59 returned to the Soviet Union, he continued his naval career. He eventually rose to the rank of Vice Admiral. He became head of the Kirov Naval Academy. He retired in the mid-1980s. He did not receive any special recognition for what he had done on October 27, 1962. He couldn't. The entire incident was classified. The submarine commanders were told not to speak about it. For 40 years, this story simply did not exist in any public record. Arkhipov died in 1998. One source gives his death year as 1998, another as 1999. The records vary slightly. He was in his early to mid-70s. He died, by all accounts, quietly, without public fanfare, in a country that no longer called itself the Soviet Union. The story became public in 2002 at a conference in Havana marking the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Former Soviet submarine commanders began to speak. Documents began to surface. Vadim Orlov, a naval intelligence officer who had been aboard B-59, confirmed the nuclear torpedo incident. Arkhipov had been dead for 4 years by the time the world learned his name. In 2017, the Future of Life Institute created a new award, the Future of Life Award, specifically to recognize people who had taken exceptional action to protect humanity, often at personal risk, often without recognition. The first recipient was Vasily Arkhipov, awarded posthumously to his family. Here's what I keep coming back to in this story. On October 27, 1962, the two most powerful men in the world, Kennedy and Khrushchev, were negotiating what would become a peaceful resolution to the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were talking. The diplomatic machinery was working. The thing that almost derailed all of it was not a decision made in the Kremlin or the White House. It was a decision made in a submarine by an exhausted man in 50-degree heat who nobody on the surface knew was having to make it. The formal architecture of nuclear deterrence, the protocols, the chain of command, the carefully designed systems meant to prevent accidental war, came within one vote of breaking down completely in a situation none of the designers had anticipated. A submarine out of contact with Moscow, a crew that didn't know a war hadn't started, two officers who believed, reasonably, that firing was the right call, and one man who said, "Let's find out what's happening first. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not a sophisticated strategic calculation, not a brilliant insight into geopolitics. Just, let's make sure we know what's actually going on before we do something we can't take back." It turns out that in October 1962, that was enough. Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, Vice Admiral, Naval Academy Commander, K-19 survivor, the man who was in the right place, with the right rank, and the right temperament, at the exact moment the world needed all three. He voted no. And here we are,